Hi, and welcome to this episode of the In Talks With podcast. I'm Danielle Radoichin. In this episode, we are looking at the way a physical space can impact an artist's work. First up, Charleston, that famous home in the rolling Sussex hills of southeast England, which was home to the Bloomsbury Set during the First and Second World Wars, and which still attracts fans of Virginia Woolf, her sister Vanessa Bell, and their wider group of friends who stayed there, and which continues to be held up as a beacon of artistic and sexual freedom. This summer, the space plays host to an exhibition of the artists George and Betty Woodman, a husband and wife team of artists who, although not contemporaneous with the Bloomsbury Group, Betty lived from 1930 until 2018 and George from 1932 until 2017, nonetheless share something. That is, embracing a life filled with creativity in a home away from the hustle and bustle of the city. In George and Betty's case, that meant leaving New York for their farmhouse in Antella, just outside of Florence in Italy. The exhibition at Charleston is both the first combined presentation of the artist's work in the UK and the first exhibition of George Woodman's work to be shown in the UK. Featuring paintings and photographs by George and ceramic sculpture, paintings and bronze benches by Betty, the show focuses on the couple's prolific time in Italy, where for nearly 5 decades they lived and worked at their farmhouse in Antella. Betty is renowned for synthesising ceramics and painting and credited with elevating the latter into the realms of high art. Remarkably, she was the first living woman artist to receive a retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. George is known for his formally inventive tessellations and complex understanding of colour, which evolved directly from his summers spent working in his Antella studio. The exhibition at Charleston is the first to closely examine the influence of Antella on both the artists' lives and work. For this episode about Betty and George, and about Charleston and Antella, I first spoke to Emily Hill, who is acting head of exhibitions at Charleston, and then later with Lissa McClure, executive director of the Woodman Family Foundation. I hope you enjoy the show. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Danielle.
It's lovely to see you over the internet, not in person, on a Monday morning. I did see you in person the other day when I visited the new exhibition at Charleston, but you were busy getting ready for the festival there.
We were, yeah.
Yeah, I felt very privileged to be there without other visitors and have the space to myself, actually. What's the festival? Is it a kind of annual thing, or what is it?
Yeah, it's been going for over 30 years. It's Charleston Festival. So it's one of our set of 5 festivals at Charleston that we programme year round. But it's a 10-day literary festival. So we have kind of thousands of people on site every day in a tent in the garden to enjoy kind of speakers, literary artists. It's great fun. Yeah, it's a real buzzy event on site, which is always lovely to be a part of.
Yeah, I can really imagine. And you have a job that lots of people would be very envious of, working at the head of special projects at the Charleston Trust. Charleston holds a special fascination for a lot of people. Mm. Tell me about the place and what you do there.
Yeah, absolutely. So my job, I'm acting head of exhibitions at Charleston. So I look after our temporary exhibition programme. So we have this amazing new set of galleries built in 2018. So we have a year-round programme of exhibitions. They're sometimes historic, they're sometimes contemporary, sometimes it's a mix of both. But it's always kind of linked to a history of ideas that the Bloomsbury Set were involved in when they were at Charleston. But more broadly, Charleston Charleston was the kind of country setting of the Bloomsbury Group. It's where they lived between 1918 and 1978. The Bloomsbury Group were a gang of thinkers, writers, and artists, and they used Charleston to imagine society differently. So the artists Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant lived there, Quentin Bell, Julian Bell, Bunny Garnett, and then Clive Bell later on. In fact, they moved down to Charleston in 1916 as conscientious objectors. So they opposed violence in war. The men did war work, and Vanessa Bell kind of ran the household and painted. But Charleston became a kind of huge part of the rest of their lives. So after the war ended in 1918, they moved back to London. But Charleston is this kind of fixture in their lives as a summer house up until the Second World War, where Vanessa Bell, Clive Bell, and Duncan Grant, move in permanently. So they're this kind of queer family of artists and best friends that live together and work together for most of their lives.
And over throughout the years, it became a sort of hub of artistic, creative activity. Since then, why do you think it's become a pilgrimage destination almost? Is it just the cult of Virginia Woolf and Bloomsbury, or do you think it's more than that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it's something we think about quite a lot at Charleston. Yes, I think the cult of Virginia Woolf is huge and worldwide, and it's kind of such an interesting feminist perspective on modernism. I think Virginia Woolf changed the world, absolutely. But I think Bloomsbury ideas are really, really contemporary and relevant. I think they were a really kind of amazing queer collective. They wrote about queerness and made art about queerness in a way that no one else was doing at the time. I'm thinking about Virginia Woolf, Orlando, and some of Duncan Grant's erotic drawings that we've just shown at Charleston recently for the first time. But also, I think it's just the kind of DIY nature of the collective, I think, seems really accessible to people today. I love going around, there's a bench outside the house that I love to sit sometimes and have my lunch outside, and you hear people coming off the tours of the house and just saying, oh, I'm going to go home and do something now. So the Bloomsbury Group didn't just make kind of paintings, they touched absolutely every facet of the house. So they'd make lampshades, they painted walls, they painted tables, they made fabric, they made ceramics. And this kind of attitude of art being part of your everyday life, I think, feels relevant now and particularly interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And I suppose part of the reason for Charleston's ongoing draw as a destination is these exhibitions that you put on, as well as the permanent house, which is a sort of museum in itself.
Yes.
Currently, you have one featuring the American artists Betty and George Woodman. Tell me about that.
This is a really, really exciting exhibition for us. I might start by saying ceramics are really important to the kind of story of Charleston. So Quentin Bell, who was Vanessa Bell and Clive Bell's son, created a pottery at Charleston when he lived there. So there's ceramics all over the house. You can't walk in one room without seeing the ceramics they collected, the ceramics the Bloomsbury Group painted, the ceramics that Quentin made, but also they used it as a subject in their art as well. So they were kind of completely obsessed. So I think that's a really nice stepping stone for this exhibition about Betty Woodman and George Woodman. This exhibition at Charleston really explores the kind of lifelong partnership and lifelong dialogue in art between these two characters and artists, Betty Woodman and George Woodman, who were a couple and they were married in their lives. And then it also focuses on a kind of untold story, which I think is quite interesting, about a farmhouse called Antella. So they bought this farmhouse in Italy in 1968, and it was this rundown stone Tuscan farmhouse with chickens in the living room. But it's just positioned just outside of Florence in the hills. And they returned there every year for the rest of their lives. So there's this synergy between this kind of creative space at Charleston and this creative space of Antella. George describes Antella as a kind of artist residency for two. And they go there every year and they live together there with their family and they work together as well. And it's this kind of creative blank page. I think that Betty describes Antella as one of the great privileges of her life, and it's kind of this idea of returning to a blank page every year and how that affected her artistic process. It was just a fresh start, which really made her, I think, more experimental.
And is Antella still there today?
It's still there, yes. It's owned by the family. I haven't visited Antella, but our director, Nathaniel Hepburn, has last summer, and so I got lots of incredible pictures. But much like Charleston, the artists had their work kind of up and all around the house. They painted the tiles in the backsplash in the kitchen. They created these amazing shelves with which Betty hung her ceramics. George actually fully tiled the bathroom in the 1980s there, which is incredible to look at. And they decorated the garden as well. The garden is full of Betty's pots and her kilns.
So there is this similar idea to what you were just describing at Charleston of making art a part of your daily life. Let's just talk about Betty and George themselves. Betty was born in 1930 in Connecticut, and she had an early fascination with pottery and went on to become a teacher, I believe. Ultimately, she became known for taking ceramics beyond this sort of traditional realm of being a sort of practical object. Like, you think of a vase, for instance. Can you tell me a bit about how she was doing that, how she was moving it beyond its traditional boundaries?
She was a pioneering ceramicist, but started her career as a functional potter, and she used to make kind of beautiful objects of utility for use in the domestic setting. So many of the things they used at Antella and at home in Colorado and Boulder, and also in New York in their apartment there, were the things that she made. So absolute kind of functional pottery with kind of utility value. She used to make dinner sets and decorative pottery and things like that. But as she kind of moves throughout her career, she becomes more interested in kind of conceptual and sculptural work. But I think what's really interesting is she continues, or she's always interested in domesticity as a theme. So she kind of pushes the boundaries of ceramics into sculpture, but the vase is always her muse, for example, and she always uses utility as something that she comes back to and thinks about for the rest of her life. So she does that by really playing with scale. So often she has a period called kind of transitional objects. So it's this transition between these utilitarian functional pots and then more kind of sculptural conceptual works. And they're really interesting. We have a couple on show in the exhibition at Charleston where she really plays with scale. So you've got Aragosta soup terrine, which is an Italian lobster soup, Aragosta soup. But the terrine is absolutely huge. It's like 1/2 meter long and wide. So it's almost kind of ridiculous. But she starts using domesticity as a subject rather than the object of her works. Yeah.
She was also a mother. So
yes.
Presumably she was in the domestic realm a lot, as well as working and teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think she has lots of interesting things to say about kind of feminism in her work, how women are not only artists, but also subjects of paintings and artwork by male painters. And I think that's a thread that she follows throughout her work. But yeah, Betty often talks about how being a potter actually allowed her, that transition between her idea of a potter and an artist allowed her to continue doing childcare. So I think this starting as a functional potter and then leading up to her work, having working galleries as an artist is part of her journey. She also liked to travel a lot. She was incredibly inspired by travels and traveled all over the world and quite extensively. What are some of the influences that she was absorbing and representing in her work? Yeah, I think Betty was always a really, really kind of close looker. She was a really considered artist, and she travelled all over the world. I think that her and George were very much a kind of post-war generation where they were able to travel again in the 1950s, and this was a kind of an amazing so
they married in 1953, is that right?
They did, yes. Married in 1953.
So, and they travelled together, or?
Yeah, they travelled together. I mean, Antella is an amazing part of the story that we look at in the exhibition, but it's only kind of one of the spaces they felt really inspired by. They did travelling in Europe, but also in East Asia, in Japan and Korea, and some of the works in the exhibition show the kind of mutual influences of the kind of East Asian drawings and East Asian paintings in their works.
So let's talk about George a bit as well. Sort of born just couple of years after Betty, 1932. I believe he went to Harvard, and when they married in 1953, he was teaching in Boston. What was his journey to becoming an artist? Because his work is quite different, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, George's work is different from Betty's. So kind of out of the two, I think he's the lesser known artist. And this show is the first show of his work in the UK. So we're really excited to kind of present it to a UK audience for the first time. He was a painter, and then kind of later in his career, he was a photographer. He was a lecturer at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And that's where they lived for much of their lives. And he went to Harvard and studied philosophy, but was always really, really interested in art. And in fact, him and Betty met at a pottery class that she was teaching in 1950. So she was a teacher and he was a student. Can
I just jump in there? Would that
have
been was pottery and ceramics seen as a sort of inferior art at that time to the sort of more perhaps macho painterly disciplines?
Yes, absolutely. I think that ceramics was very much considered a kind of craft art form, not shown in galleries in the 1950s. Not this, as you say, this kind of macho painting that was going on at the time. And I think
for George to have gone to the class in itself would have been makes him seem sort of broad-minded.
Yes, absolutely. I think George and Betty had quite different upbringings. I think Betty's was quite fluid and she chose to be a potter and that was okay with her parents. George went to Harvard. He studied philosophy because they didn't have an arts course that was suitable for him at the time. So he was kind of getting his arts fill in other ways. So he was interested in ceramics and joined this class where Betty was teaching.
What was as their work evolved over the years, what was the interaction and dialogue between their work? How did that develop? Was there a sort of dialogue there?
Yes, absolutely. I think what the show kind of explores is a lifelong dialogue between them with shared influences as they kind of travel the world together. There's not many examples of direct collaboration between both artists, but we have a couple on show at Charleston where it was one of the first times they spent considerable months in Italy. George got a kind of fellowship with the University of Colorado, and Betty did a Fulbright Hayes fellowship. So they both had enough money in this grant money to live and work in Italy for a year, and they moved their family over and they lived just outside of Florence in what sounds like a kind of a wild house. This amazing landlord who had exotic birds walking throughout the garden, and they really, really immersed themselves in Italian culture for that year. And that kind of led them, I think, to buying Antella a couple of years later. But Betty was there to study Etruscan ceramics. So it's this kind of pre-Roman folk pottery. And she studied under an Italian potter for this year. She would make these works and she never really painted her own work. And so George, being a painter, she asked him to paint them. And they did this for some time, but George began objecting, and it almost felt to him like a Ford production line. So she'd be furiously making these pots and he'd be painting them, and it wasn't the kind of perhaps slow collaboration that he was interested in. So he says, I'm not going to paint your pots anymore. And then Betty stops having painted pots for a while. She kind of isn't quite confident enough to start painting by herself, never considers herself as an artist or a painter at this time. And then a couple of years later, she returns to it and she starts painting herself. But I think that really opened her up to considering painting in ceramics to be something different. She wasn't attempting to create the same style as George in every way. It kind of gave her a certain amount of freedom. And then I think that then she starts thinking about the way that George approaches a canvas as a painter. And then this, I think, leads her to do incredible, really, really interesting things in her work, where she begins to see her pots, her vases, her ceramics as canvases for work. And one of the one of the pieces on show in the exhibition is a piece in two vases that are kind of positioned next to each other, and she paints a full Gorgam copy of a Gorgam painting the whole way up the front of one side, but also in the kind of negative space in the bowl of the pot as well, which I think was incredibly unusual, really groundbreaking and interesting. And then on the other side, she paints 2D paintings of pots, so you've got this kind of really, really layered way of making, where the vase is the base, which has kind of always been, and that's a history of ceramics that she's nodding to, but then also you've got this feminist history or feminist art history that she's making a comment on, and then on the other side you have her painting vases on vases. So it's this really kind of layered ideas that I think she has in conversation with George, and he's teaching kind of philosophy and the philosophy of art and criticism. So they're speaking about kind of modernism and classic art a lot of the time.
There's a quote of hers that I picked up from the exhibition. I can't remember there's a lovely video of them recorded at Antella, and I can't remember if I caught it in the video or if it was on one of the wall captions, but she says, I try to make art which appreciates the richness of ceramic history, but not try to imitate it. And I thought that was a lovely quote, and really reflected her and her work. And also the other sense I got there was this, what you're talking about, the interaction as artists, but I got this real sense being in the space and at the exhibition of her flamboyance and freedom of crossing the parameters of the boundary of the edge of a canvas, or put it, the way that she sort of moves between disciplines. Whereas with George, it's this very quiet, sort of structured, calm output. I was really struck by the difference between those. They also, I think this whole idea of having this idyllic farmhouse in Italy to escape to all seems like a sort of utopian idea of, this idea of escaping to Southern Europe to follow your artistic dreams. It's just, and this idea, it's incredibly joyful as a way of living, but there was sadness in their life as well. Both of their children became artists, but their daughter, Francesca, committed suicide in her 30s. Is this something that you can see? Was there a change in their work around this time, or did it have any obvious effect on their work?
Yes, I think absolutely. Francesca spent a lot of time at Antella with Betty and George, and some of her works are made there. She is an incredible photographer who often uses her own body in her work. Yes, I think so. I think their work changed. Incredible kind of trauma for the family to go through. And after her death, George's work becomes a bit more figurative, which I think is an influence directly that you can directly relate to Francesca's work. He begins getting really, really interested in photography, and that was her medium. And his work becomes, figurative. It has people in it. It becomes softer. There's a kind of almost a femininity to it. He's really interested in the body and the female body and the classical body, which is something that she explores a lot in her work.
Go on.
Sorry. The organisation that we're working in partnership with this exhibition is the Woodman Family Foundation, and they steward Francesca's work, but also Betty Woodman's work and George Woodman's work.
And Charles, what's he up to these days?
Yeah. Charles is a kind of chair of trustees of the Woodman Foundation, so still works closely with the Family Foundation in a way to create a legacy of Francesca's work, to make sure there's an archive and people can borrow from it and there's research being done on it. But yes, Charles is a kind of video artist, kind of mixed media artist, which I think you can see the rest of the family don't do one thing. There's a kind of exploratory nature of their work. They're not held back by any kind of particular medium.
Absolutely. What about George and Betty's recognition of their work during their lifetime? I know Betty was given a major retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in 2006, which isn't, at the time, especially because it was the first time a living woman
Yes.
and a working ceramicist had been honoured in this way, it must have been an incredible accolade. Was their work, were they famous, well known? What was
the
public attitude to them?
Absolutely. I mean, Betty was an incredibly well-known artist, and as you say, first living female artist with a Met retrospective is incredible. I think that she's an absolute kind of pioneer of the late 20th century kind of American work, and should have been celebrated. And it's unfortunate that at that time it hadn't already, no living woman artist or potter had that accolade at the Met. But yeah, they were popular in their time, both exhibited widely across the US and then later in their life across Europe and in Japan. Betty obviously had a huge retrospective at the Met, but also a wonderful show at the ICA in London that celebrated her later work. So both of them were really working right up until their deaths in the 2010s and making really fantastic work.
And since their deaths, has recognition of their work continued to grow? Has appreciation of their work continued to grow, would you say? Or is perhaps that's the reason for this whole exhibition at Charleston?
Yeah. Betty was included in the Hayward Gallery Strange Place show, which was fantastic and great to see such a huge installation of her work. But also I think that ceramics is having another moment. I mean, it's interesting. You can see in interviews of Betty, she's always asked about the importance of ceramics and ceramics in modern art and how it's seen and perceived and celebrated. And she says throughout her career, ceramics is having a moment now, and then it's kind of back to painting. But I mean, I think that she paved the way in many respects for the way that we see ceramics now.
For you personally, having worked so closely on this exhibition, what are the main things you've learned or the main ideas that you've taken away?
That's a lovely question. Personally, really post-COVID, I am drawn to kind of really, really like material sculptural shows. So I think that her work is, the work in the show is really, really delicious in the way that it plays with 3D and 2D work. I think the colour in the exhibition is phenomenal. The way that the two artists, I think, work in like really, really, really bright, joyful colour for their whole lives. One of the first pieces in the show that you see are these two huge paintings, one by George and one by Betty. And George's is untitled and it's painted in 1970, and Betty's is called Kitchen Table, and it's painted in 2010 or 2017. But they have exactly the same color palette. It's this like really bright pink, yellow and orange, and it's just like pure joy that followed them, I think, throughout their lives. I think that Betty and George had a shared philosophy of trying to make quite complicated ideas really accessible through works, and I think there's a joy in both of their works that really links them together as artists. I like to think that you'd also take away the kind of idea of collaboration. I think sometimes the way that we speak about artists, and I think this is changing now, is that there's this kind of single genius and they did everything by themselves. And I think what's lovely about the Bloomsbury Group is they were a really, really collaborative and supportive friendship gang. And you can see that in the work of Betty and George. They didn't directly collaborate on many things, but this kind of influence of art and creativity and support that they had at home really, really changed their lives.
Those are lovely thoughts. Thank you so much, Emily, for speaking to me today.
Thank you. It's been absolutely wonderful to think about the show with you.
My next guest is Lissa McClure, Executive Director of the Woodman Family Foundation and who knew Betty and George personally. She joined me from Brooklyn, New York. So Lissa, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
I was hoping you could explain a bit about the capacity in which you work on the Woodman Family Foundation and your personal relationship to them.
Sure. So the foundation actually was started by Betty and George in 1994, but it was not active, and it was meant to be active upon their deaths. And they were considering obviously at the time, the stewardship that they had already been doing for their daughter, Francesca Woodman's work since her death in 1981. So they had inherited all of her work and were doing an amazing job of stewarding her work and caring for her legacy. And this was a family that was prolific, all of them. So there was a lot of artwork. And Betty and George were artists who liked to show what they were making in the moment and didn't like to look back. So we are in the great fortunate position of having works from all periods for all three of them. So upon George's and Betty's death, George passed away in 2017 and Betty 9 months after in 2018, the foundation sort of began getting put together. I joined in 2019, and we've just been slowly sort of building and receiving bequests. Slowly but surely, Betty's estate has transferred everything to us. So we now have all of the artwork by all three artists, and we have each of their archives, which includes individual correspondence and ephemera of various types, but also some sort of inter-family correspondence and interesting family photographs, many boxes of those. So we will eventually finish processing the archive. We're getting close, and we'll have a study center. So we hope to open that up to scholars and researchers so that they can come in and find new and interesting ways to look at this work. And then we are tasked with the sort of lovely task of getting this work to remain in the public view and consciousness. And we work with museum shows and publications and galleries. So we're really our mission is to further the understanding of their works and sort of get it out there.
It's lovely. And where are you based?
Another fortunate aspect, we are based in Betty's former studio in the Woodman's loft that they lived in Chelsea for 40 years, that Francesca actually found for them in 1980. They had been living in Boulder, Colorado, where they were both teaching. George was the head of the art department at UC Boulder. And then they had always had, since 1968, the house in Antella in Tuscany. And then they bought the loft in Chelsea in 1980. And so we've set up our office in her former studio, which is lovely. Yeah. And you had asked earlier, my relationship with them. I had actually worked with Betty and George for over a decade on Francesca's work when I was with Marian Goodman Gallery. So we knew each other well. And I knew Katerina Jernick, their curator, who is now our curator, luckily. So it really does feel like a labor of love and a personal kind of investment.
And it would be remiss of me to not ask, as someone who knew them personally, what were they like as people?
They were incredible. They were very unique, each of them. First, they were completely a pair, artistically, in life, in art, in travel. And so they really operated that way, but they were also very different. And Betty was feisty and smart, and she could be tough. She took care of business, but she was also super warm and gracious. George had a really dry, interesting sense of humor, very serious about art. He studied philosophy. He was a really brilliant guy. He wrote a great deal, and they were great counterbalances to one another. They jogged on the West Side Highway in New York into their 80s. They went everywhere on the subway. They saw every show of every artist in New York when they were here. They were really great. They were really unique.
But did they have a sense of their legacy and how that was going to be handled after their death?
Interestingly, yes. Part yes and part no. They very carefully set up a board of directors for the foundation, which is filled with dear friends who were also colleagues in the art world. So we are in another fortunate position where we have a board that knew them very well and knows their work very well, curators who did shows with them, et cetera. So to that extent, they did set it up, but they didn't leave many dictates about what we were to do. So in a way, it's a tabula rasa in some ways, and we get to sort of with an understanding of who they were and what was important to them, we are, making our way and trying to get things done.
Best job ever.
I hate to say, but it kind of is. I feel like I shouldn't tell anyone, but it is a really great job. Yeah.
And Antella, the small village just outside, or as part, just near Florence in Italy, where they had their place. Is that somewhere you visited?
I have, yes.
So I'm very happy. Yeah, I'm very happy that you've visited, because Emily directed me towards you. I was hoping you could give the listeners a sense of what it's like traveling there, and what the space is like in the area, and why Betty and George loved it so much or felt so connected to it.
Sure. It's interesting. Similarly to the archaic elevator in their loft building in Chelsea that takes half an hour to get up and down and out of, and taking the subway, it is not easy access in Antella. So they actually started spending time there in the 50s. Betty went by herself first in the 50s. And then they went in the mid to late 59 and 60. And in 1968, they bought this house. So they had some time in Tuscany and really just fell in love with the landscape, and Italian culture and art was really important to them. So the story goes, George got a Guggenheim grant, and they decided to buy this farmhouse, which was, we say rustic. It is modest, but it is literally overlooking the vistas and the rolling hills and olive gardens of Tuscany. And on a clear day, you can see the Duomo and downtown Florence. So it's really spectacular. To get there, you go to Florence and you rent a car, and you hold on for dear life after you've driven about 25 minutes to get to the house. It's up on the top of a hill, and you literally go on a single.
So it's a sort of half-hour drive, is it?
From Florence, yeah. So you arrive. There's a little cluster of other houses there. There's a big stone wall with a couple of Betty's pillow pictures and a bright blue door. And then you get into the sort of terraced garden that overlooks the aforementioned landscape. So they each had studios there. Hers was her last one. She had several over the decades, but her last studio was sort of open air, looking out over to the hills. And George had a dark room and a painting studio. And they grew vegetables and made their own olive oil and huge flower garden. And they loved having people come and visit them all summer long. They were there about 6 months of the year after the mid 90s.
And so it's still very much as it was when they lived there?
For the most part, yes. Their son, Charles Woodman, who's also an artist, inherited the house, and he and his family use it. And he is also starting an artist residency there. So in the spirit of them loving to work there so much, he wanted to kind of open that up to other artists as well.
In terms of people, so people wanted to visit Antella and the Chelsea properties. Is that something that can be arranged on a case-by-case basis?
It's interesting because the Chelsea apartment also now belongs to their son, and he and his family stay there when they come to New York. So we don't really have access to the apartment, and that has changed now. So it is not as they left it, though the kitchen is, which is good because it has a lot of tiles, and the bathrooms as well with George's tiles and Betty's tiles. So they're not really open to the public so much. I think for the Antella house via the residency, that may happen more. There may be more events there and things, but at the moment, they're not super open to the public.
In terms of the work itself, how do you feel it resonates in today's culture? If that isn't too much of a broad question.
It's a big question, but I like it. There's a lot to say. I would hope that I can say confidently that Betty has had something to do with the sort of renaissance of ceramics. And I think she was such a renegade in the early days because she started out as a functional potter and then didn't want to be limited to that and didn't want to be limited to craft and sort of woman's work. But she held on to those ideas of the domestic and interior spaces and the vase and decoration, but sort of subverted many of the ways that the contemporary art world sort of distanced itself from those materials and those kind of ideas. And so I think her work is resonating now because it is it is prescient in a way. And she literally combined painting and sculpture, and she combined ceramic and made it sculpture. And I think also for Betty, I think there's an increasing interest in women artists of a certain age who literally were working for decades and decades. And she is very lucky. She had great success during her lifetime. I mean, she was the first living woman artist to have an exhibition at the Met.
Yeah. Do you
Cecily
remember?
Brown has one up now, and she's only the second, which is awful.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Do you remember her? I was going to ask you, do you remember her reaction to that when she found out she was going to have that?
Well, she worked very hard to help make that happen. And this is what I mean. She was very determined, and she really went for what she wanted. And so she was really happy that happened. And I think, but always wanted more. I mean, she wasn't one to rest on her laurels. She definitely was on to the next thing and had the next goal for herself and wanted the next person to see her work. I mean, she was pretty driven that way. Yeah. And for George, it's interesting because his trajectory has been different. He originally was the much better known of the family in the 60s and 70s and mid 70s, early 80s. He was showing in New York. He was in an exhibition at the Guggenheim in 1981. They bought a work. And he was primarily a painter back then, geometric abstraction, hard edge abstraction, doing these really rigorous system-based approaches to painting coming out of minimalism, oddly, that he was often mistaken for pattern and decoration, but he had a much different approach. It would never be decorative for him. It was much more academic for him. And then he slowly transferred into photography, and in between did these amazing tiles, both in paper and in ceramic, that were very much in in a Lewisian sense, putting together patterns that repeat but do not continue in a certain way. And so I think his trajectory was different. Yeah.
Did she resent that, or were they always in a kind of collaborative sense, or was there any sort of sense of friendly competition?
I don't know if it was. They were such staunch supporters of one another's work, and also they were the ear that each of them went to talk through whatever they were working on. I think during the day they were literally just back and forth between their studios talking, and then they would see so much art together and talk that through. And I think partly that's what's so beautiful about the Charleston show is that it was this great opportunity to literally show all of those dialogues over decades, works from 30 years apart that are very similar in palette, or approaching pattern in a specific way or particular way, or using art historical references. So I wouldn't say they were competitive. I think they were really supportive and each driven in their own way. And they didn't stop. I mean, they each worked right up until the end, well into their 80s. Yeah. Art was a religion for both of them.
Such a nice story, isn't it? All right. Well, Lissa, thank you so much for talking to me. It's really nice to get this sort of added texture and bit of extra depth to the conversation I had previously with Emily. So I really appreciate you talking to me. Thank you.
Sure. My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks.
You've been listening to In Talks with me, Danielle Redoitjen. The sound and theme music is by Woogie Productions, and the artwork is by Patrick Waugh. If you enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to someone who you think might also like it. Please subscribe and leave a review. To pitch for guest ideas, you can DM me via my socials at Danielle Redoitjen. Thanks for listening.